Imagine waking up tomorrow and your entire life savings, everything you worked for, every coin you pinched, every sacrifice you made is now worth less than a cup of coffee. Not because you made a bad investment, not because of a flood or a fire, but because your government printed too much paper. This isn't a horror movie. It's happened, repeatedly, to real people, in real countries. And understanding how is one of the most important economic lessons in all of human history. This is the story of hyperinflation. And trust me, it's stranger, darker, and more fascinating than you think. Welcome back to Chishell. Today we're going to travel across centuries and continents from ancient China to 21st century Zimbabwe to explore the moments when money itself completely collapsed. Stay with me because by the end of this, you'll never view a banknote the same way again. First, let's get one thing straight. Inflation is normal. Prices go up a little every year. That's actually healthy in a functioning economy. When inflation is around 2%, economists basically do a little fist pump. But hyperinflation? That's a different beast entirely. By definition, hyperinflation kicks in when prices rise more than 50% per month. Not per year, per month. That's the technical threshold. In practice, the worst cases have seen prices doubling every few hours. Here's the simple version of how it happens. A government, usually desperate, usually at war, usually already in trouble, decides to print more money. More money chasing the same amount of goods means each note is worth less. Prices rise to compensate. People lose faith in the currency. The government panics and prints even more. And suddenly, you're in a death spiral. It is, in the most literal sense, the moment when a country loses control of reality. Let's start at the very beginning. Here's something most people don't know. China invented paper money. And China also became the first civilization to learn, the hard way, just how dangerous it can be. For centuries, China used coins heavy, bulky, inconvenient. Paper notes were a revelation. Lightweight, portable, elegant. Marco Polo himself was apparently amazed when he encountered them in the 13th century. He wrote that the Great Khan could essentially print his own wealth out of mulberry bark. It seemed almost magical. And it worked. For a while. The Yuan Dynasty, which ruled from 1271 to 1368, became the first to truly experience what we'd today call hyperinflation. They were funding enormous military campaigns, invasions of Japan, of Vietnam, of Java. All of that cost money, and rather than raise taxes or cut spending, they did what governments throughout history would keep doing. They printed. As the currency flooded the market, merchants started refusing it. Prices skyrocketed. People couldn't afford food. The government's credibility collapsed, and so did the dynasty itself. The Yuan Dynasty's story is deeply poignant because they weren't stupid. They discovered something genuinely revolutionary. But they also discovered its fatal flaw, and they paid with their empire. Every civilization since has been playing the same game with the same dangerous tool. Now we come to the case that defined the word. Weimar Germany, 1923. This is the one you've probably heard about. And everything you've heard is true and somehow still not dramatic enough. After World War I, Germany was crushed under the weight of the Treaty of Versailles. The reparations bill was astronomical. In 1922, Germany simply couldn't make a payment and told the Allied powers it didn't have the money. France didn't believe them. In response, French and Belgian troops marched in and occupied the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. The German government's response? They told workers in the Ruhr to go on strike. Passive resistance, they called it. Stop producing. Don't cooperate with the occupiers. We'll pay your wages anyway. which sounds noble. Until you ask, where was that money coming from? The printing press, running nonstop. In January 1922, a loaf of bread in Berlin cost about 160 marks. By November 1923, that same loaf cost 200 billion marks. That's not a typo, 200 billion marks. For bread, workers were being paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before they lost all value by lunch. Families burned stacks of cash for heat because it was cheaper than buying wood. Children built towers out of currency notes because they were essentially worthless rectangles of paper. The middle class was annihilated. People who had spent their entire lives saving, teachers, civil servants, pensioners, watched everything they had dissolve in a matter of months. The government eventually stabilized the currency by introducing a new one, the Rentenmark, backed by land rather than gold. And it worked, but the damage was done. What I find most haunting about this story is, the economic catastrophe of 1923 created a generation of Germans who were utterly humiliated, impoverished, and furious. Historians widely argue that this social powder keg, this sense of betrayal and desperation, was essential to the rise of the Nazi Party less than a decade later. Hitler didn't come out of nowhere. He came out of wheelbarrows full of worthless money. That connection should never be forgotten. When Germany invaded Greece in 1941, they brought something even more insidious than soldiers. They brought economic destruction. The Axis occupiers seized control of Greek industry and exported goods at artificially low prices, draining the country's resources. People began hoarding food in panic, which immediately drove prices up. Naval blockades choked off imports. And then the Bank of Greece was pressured to print more and more drachma to fund the occupiers' needs. By October 1944, Greece had reached peak hyperinflation. Prices were doubling every 4.3 days. The monthly inflation rate hit 13,800%. People were starving in the streets of Athens while German soldiers ate well. Food was being bartered because money had become meaningless. When the Germans finally left, hyperinflation collapsed almost immediately, which tells you everything about who was driving it. But recovery was agonizingly slow. It wasn't until 1947 that prices began to genuinely stabilize. What strikes about Greece is the weaponization of hyperinflation. In this case, it wasn't just mismanagement, it was deliberate economic warfare. The occupiers exploited the monetary system as a tool of control. It's a reminder that hyperinflation isn't always an accident. This one wins. In purely mathematical terms, nothing in all of recorded history has ever come close to what Hungary experienced in 1946. Hungary was in ruins at the end of World War II. The physical infrastructure of the country had been devastated. The economy was non-functional. And then, to make things dramatically worse, the Soviet army arrived and began issuing its own military currency alongside the existing pengo, creating total monetary chaos. The Hungarian government took over banknote printing and essentially lost all discipline. From the end of 1945 to July 1946, just 9 months, Hungary recorded the highest inflation ever measured in any country at any point in history. At its absolute peak, prices were doubling every 15.6 hours. 15.6 hours. Hungary had to invent an entirely new currency just for paying taxes. The Adopingo and its value was announced on the radio every single day, because by the next morning it would be different. The denomination of banknotes eventually reached numbers that most calculators can't display. A quintillion pengo. That's a 1 followed by 18 zeros. The solution? Scrap everything. In August 1946, the Hungarian forint was introduced, and the economy was essentially rebuilt from scratch. Fast forward to the 1990s. Yugoslavia is fracturing along ethnic and political lines. The economy has collapsed, international sanctions are biting, and the government is printing money, just to keep the lights on. By October 1994, prices in Yugoslavia were doubling every 34 hours. Citizens couldn't buy basic food or clothing. The government responded by introducing banknotes with ever higher denominations, which only accelerated the panic. People resorted to smuggling goods across borders just to survive. Eventually, Yugoslavia abandoned its own currency entirely and adopted the German mark. The irony being that Germany, the country that had experienced its own catastrophic hyperinflation 70 years earlier, was now the stable anchor that others clung to. And now we arrive at perhaps the most heartbreaking story on this list. Because Zimbabwe shouldn't have ended up here. When Zimbabwe gained independence from British colonial rule in 1980, there was real optimism. The country was rich in minerals, had strong agricultural output, and had some of the highest literacy rates in Africa. For a brief period, the Zimbabwean dollar was actually worth more than the US dollar. Then came the land reforms. Under President Robert Mugabe, white-owned farms which produced the majority of the country's food were seized and redistributed. But many recipients had no farming experience. Production collapsed. The agricultural sector, which had been Zimbabwe's backbone, cratered. The economy began to unravel. Mugabe's government, rather than restructure, printed money to fund military spending and cover the budget deficit. A vicious cycle took hold. By November 2008, Zimbabwe's month-over-month inflation was 600%. The annual rate was estimated at 231 million%. Think about what that means in practice. A loaf of bread in 2008 cost what 12 brand new cars had cost just a decade earlier. Infrastructure collapsed. Hospitals ran out of medicines. Schools closed. Water stopped flowing in Harare, the capital. Workers couldn't afford bus fare to their jobs. Doctors and teachers fled the country by the hundreds of thousands. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe eventually printed a $100 trillion note, a denomination that had never existed in any currency in history, and which could barely buy a bus ticket. The crisis was only resolved when Zimbabwe abandoned its own currency altogether and allowed US dollars, South African rand, and other foreign currencies to circulate freely. Zimbabwe still hasn't fully recovered. And here's what one keep coming back to. This wasn't inevitable. Zimbabwe had every ingredient for success. What it lacked was institutional discipline, honest governance, and the courage to make hard decisions. When those disappeared, so did the money. So, what's the thread that connects ancient China, 1920s, Germany, post-war Hungary, and modern Zimbabwe? It's not that these governments were run by idiots. Most of them were responding to genuine crises, wars, occupations, sanctions, collapsed agricultural sectors. The tragedy is that the solution they reached for printing more money felt rational in the short term and was catastrophic in the long term. Every single time, the pattern is the same. A crisis creates pressure. Printing money feels like a release valve, but it's not. It's actually accelerating the explosion. Because once people lose faith in a currency, there's almost no way to restore it through more of the same currency. What does stop hyperinflation? Bold, painful reform, new currencies, international intervention, austerity that makes people furious but works. Germany's Rentenmark, Hungary's forint, Zimbabwe's adoption of foreign currencies. None of these were comfortable. All of them required governments to admit failure and start over. There's also a political lesson here that matters enormously. Hyperinflation doesn't just destroy economies. It destroys trust in institutions, in governments, in the social contract itself. It creates fertile ground for authoritarian movements, scapegoating, and extremism. The road from worthless banknotes to dangerous politics is shorter than most people realize. We take money for granted. We carry it in our pockets, tap our phones to pay for coffee, check our balances without thinking. And we assume that stability is just the natural state of things. But it isn't. It's a construct, a collective agreement, a promise that has to be maintained every single day by governments that understand what they hold in their hands. History shows us, repeatedly and brutally, what happens when they forget. The good news? We have learned from these disasters at least partially. Modern central banking, independent monetary institutions, and international financial systems exist precisely because of this history. They're not perfect, but they're built on hard-won knowledge. The question is whether we remember why they were built in the first place. If you found this valuable, make sure you're subscribed to Chishell. We go deep on the stories that shaped the world you live in. Drop a comment below. Which of these cases shocked you the most? For me, it's always Hungary. Prices doubling every 15 hours. I still can't wrap my head around it. See you in the next one.